Employers everywhere are faced with concerns that arise from domestic abuse and violence. This video will help employers of all sizes recognize and respond to domestic violence abusers in the workplace in a comprehensive manner that also includes providing support to survivors of domestic violence at the workplace.
Employers should care about domestic violence because it cuts across all aspects of life here in Maine. Last year, over 6,000 people were arrested for domestic violence, and employers lost millions of dollars in productivity, downtime, and exposure for lawsuits because of domestic violence.
Employers know that our employees can't check their personal lives at the door, that when things are going on, particularly serious, upsetting things are going on at home on an employee's own time, I think that we all know that you cannot leave that behind.
48% of domestic violence abusers report difficulty concentrating at work due to domestic abuse and violence.
Domestic violence is a workplace issue because violence isn't left at the door. Whatever is happening at home does come into the workplace, and it impacts the survivor of domestic violence. It also impacts the other employees.
It can affect small companies, large companies. It affects all kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds, so it really isn't isolated to one particular type of company.
78% of domestic abusers misuse workplace resources to harass, stalk, or otherwise commit domestic abuse and violence.
Domestic abusers can impact the workplace because they're using employers' resources, employers' time. It can be very disruptive if they're using the employer's telephone to call and to harass their victims.
If they lose focus on the job and they're operating a large or small piece of equipment and have an accident or a near miss, obviously it can affect them, their physical well-being, as well as the well-being of other employees.
19% of domestic abusers report having a workplace accident or a near miss.
I was distracted when there was problems. I'd spend my time thinking about that instead of the task at hand.
I believe if someone was involved in an abuse situation, that would preoccupy their mind so very much that it would be very, very easy for them to be distracted, and in our particular case, and a lot of workplaces, you know, that can lead to very, very substantial consequences.
I drove a company vehicle primarily. I was driving that when I was arrested for violating the protection order.
As heads of organizations, as presidents, CEOs, executive directors, we have a responsibility to make sure that our workplace is safe for all of the people in there who are working for us and with us.
Under the federal OSHA Act, the employer is obligated to provide a safe workplace for individual employees under what's known as the General Duty Clause.
Legal liability associated with perhaps knowingly allowing a workplace hazard, like someone about to perpetrate some sort of violence, could have on the organization if they turn a blind eye to it.
You could have violence, you could have death, you could have disruption to your business. That's why you need to care about domestic violence in your workplace. It will have an effect on your bottom line, as well as the morale and the safety of all of your employees.
Whether an employer is a small business or a large corporation, the following 10 best practices provide a roadmap for responding to domestic violence abusers in the workplace. First and foremost, employers are encouraged to contact the experts at the local or statewide domestic violence prevention organizations. Advocates from these programs are available to help employers create a comprehensive workplace response to domestic abuse and violence.
Throughout the country, we have services for victims of abuse through, in Maine, the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence, our 9-member projects. These programs can provide consultation to employers about how it is that they can help support victims who might be working for them and help engage that system of accountability for abusers.
We couldn't have done it without them. These are the experts. They came to our workplaces and to each department and assisted in the development of a policy that clearly sets out the expectations for our employees. And they have films on how to say the right words, how to tackle this difficult issue in the workplace, things that employers ordinarily haven't thought about. They make that connection for you.
Second in the list of best practices, employers should develop policies and procedures for responding to the risks associated with domestic abuse and violence. A policy may be a detailed document or a simple statement describing procedures for response that reflect the employer's commitment to creating a nonviolent workplace.
In order for there to be a comprehensive program that addresses violence, it needs to be dealt with on multiple levels. I think the first thing is for the leadership of the company or the organization to identify this as a priority for the management team. And then I think it needs to be part of the orientation program for all new employees.
I think it's very important to have leadership involvement in developing the policies. It elevates the issue to its rightful place in terms of importance.
We have some detailed policy suggestions, procedures to follow in our employee handbook now, and it wasn't hard to really develop these.
Even large employees who already have policies in place, to take a fresh look at their policies and see whether or not they need to include specific references to domestic violence. For smaller employees or employers or employers who have no policies, this is a perfect chance for them to try to reach out to the resources that are being made available to them to put something in place.
We certainly ran the policy by the union before actually enacting it and accepted any input and buy-in. We had hoped to have the union, and we did have all of the union support the effort.
Once an employer has developed a policy and procedures, the employer implements that policy through training for all employees, beginning with supervisors and managers.
It's important to train your employees with regard to violence in the workplace and domestic violence in particular, so that they can really have a general knowledge of what the issues are and how the company responds to the issues, and what resources are available to them if they are in fact a victim or an abuser and they want to get some help.
It's important to train employees at every level, managers, supervisors, frontline employees, about the policy, because it puts them on notice, number one, that the company, the employer, has taken a position on this and doesn't condone it.
What you really need to do as a company is give snippets of training through communications on a regular basis so that you really keep it on the forefront of everybody's mind and they are always cognizant of what's available to them for resources.
One of the first things that happens when you bring training into the workplace is you find all these resources you had no idea that you had, who are people who are very concerned about these issues, absolutely delighted that the employer is taking some leadership around this. And so it really builds a new sense of community in the place and a new sense of hopefulness and unity.
An employer can limit the impact of domestic abuse and violence on the workplace by carefully screening all potential employees.
Employers should make an attempt to have a pre-employment screening process in place. Depending on the kind of job you are hiring for, different criminal history might be important to know.
The purpose of pre-employment screening is to look at possible employees and determine the risk you're bringing into the business when you hire them.
We find the pre-employment process extremely helpful as a screening tool, and we combine various components such as criminal background checks, pre-placement physicals, drug screens. All those tools help us gather information about an individual when we're making our decisions.
There are questions an employer may not legally ask during the pre-employment screening process, but there aren't any related to domestic violence.
An additional important step in the pre-employment screening process is the completion of a criminal background check.
They say that one of the greatest indicators of potential violence is past violence. So if you're concerned about hiring folks into your organization that may bring a violent culture or not support the culture you currently have, one of the ways or one of the methods to be able to evaluate that is simply to do a criminal background check.
An applicant's arrest record is not necessarily, I don't believe it should be necessarily, an automatic disqualifier for employment. You need to just probe more with that applicant if you see that on the application. We all know that being arrested doesn't mean you're guilty of a crime, and so you want this applicant to have an opportunity to explain what happened there.
When we learn that an applicant has been arrested in the past, we do have a policy set up with a matrix for evaluating that background. And the key components to that would be looking into when that crime occurred, what that crime was, conviction records and things like that. Those are all important factors, and how that might relate to the person's job and who they will be interacting with at the company.
Number 6 in the list of 10 best practices is ensuring that new employees are aware of the employer's expectations and the specific response protocols regarding domestic violence and abuse.
It is important to orient new employees with regard to all of your policies, especially violence in the workplace and domestic violence. At our company, on the first day of work, we have a very well planned orientation process that employees go through, and just even providing them with a poster with reference and resource materials is extremely important. They always have that handbook with them. Then they have a place where they can go and they can look to find information.
The next piece I want to talk to all of you about is our domestic violence in the workplace policy. It's important that all of you realize that this workplace is one that will not tolerate any form of violence or abuse, and all of you play an important role in maintaining that environment. As you read this policy, you'll see that it outlines a response to potential abusers as well as to victims of domestic violence and abuse, as well as community resources. These are also listed. Now, if after reading the policy you have any questions at all, feel free to approach me or your supervisor at any time.
When an employee's work status changes due to a promotion or transfer, it's important for the employer to screen again for violence issues that may impact the employee in that new position.
A lot of times when people do criminal background checks, pre-employment screening, they're for a very specific position, and they're looking for what crimes the person was convicted of in the past against that particular role. As they move to different roles, the requirements and acceptability of past arrests may be different. So checking that just reaffirms that the person you're placing in this position of responsibility meets the expectations in their past behaviors.
If an entry-level job would be to be out working in the warehouse, there may not be any reason for concern about a certain criminal history. But later on in that career, they're promoted into a position where they have daily contact with the public, or a supervisory role over others. It's good to check that pre-employment criminal background check again to make sure the original decision is valid in this particular job, this new job the employee is going into.
When an employer becomes aware that an employee is or may be a domestic violence abuser, the employer should conduct an internal investigation. The employee may have used workplace resources to commit the abuse, or may have committed domestic abuse off-duty. The purpose of the investigation is to determine whether the employee's conduct has a connection, sometimes called a nexus, to the workplace.
If it comes to the attention of the employer that one of their employees has been arrested for domestic violence or convicted, an employer should conduct a formal investigation into that to see whether the conduct that occurred off-duty has any connection to the job that we employ them in, and give the employee an opportunity to respond.
The following scenes depict how employers might respond to employees who have been abusive. One situation involves abuse when there's no clear connection to the workplace. Another illustrates a situation where there is a clear connection, and a third shows a situation where the connection is uncertain.
Keith, this is a difficult conversation, but your supervisor came to me this morning out of concern because your coworkers are discussing your arrest over the weekend for assaulting your wife. I wanted to spend some time with you looking at our company policies on violence in the workplace and workplace behavior and our company expectations. I know this didn't happen in the workplace, but there's potential for it to spill into the workplace and affect your performance and perhaps the performance of others. And that's something we don't want to have happen. So let's take some time right now and go over our company policies.
Although in this instance there was no clear connection or nexus between this employee's domestic violence and his job responsibilities, the employer seized the opportunity to remind him of the company's policy and pass along helpful information about resources.
It is an opportunity to educate the employee about your policy and guide them toward resources, encourage them to take advantages of the resources. Many times this behavior isn't confined to off-duty behavior. We make it clear in the state of Maine's policy that use of our resources, our telephones, use of our vehicles, use of our email system to perpetrate abuse is connected. We will not tolerate it. It is connected to your employment with us.
The next scene describes a situation in which there is a clear nexus or connection between the employee's abusive behavior and his job.
Chris, I've met with your supervisor several times over the last few weeks, trying to piece together what's been going on. After receiving a request from the police for a record of emails and telephone calls, we've confirmed that you've sent over 20 threatening emails to your ex-spouse. Now, regardless of how this criminal matter goes, I want you to know that this sort of behavior is something that we will not tolerate in any of our employees. Do you understand that? Until further notice, we're going to be monitoring all of your emails that are outgoing. Your supervisor will be doing that. I want to give you a copy of our policy. This also includes a list of helpful resources in the community that are available to you. I also want you to consider this conversation as a formal counseling session. And we'll have to take far more serious steps if this behavior continues. I really hope you'll look into those resources.
The employer's role when they actually discover that an employee is an abuser or they suspect one's an abuser is first to verify the information to make sure that what you're acting on is accurate. One of the better ways to do that is actually to talk to the employee and verify what you're at that point have been given for information. The second part is to take and look at what the impact is to the employee's actions to the workforce.
In this final example, there is again no clear connection between the employee's outside actions and his employment. However, the employee is the subject of a protection from abuse order, and the employer follows the connection or nexus inquiry by telling the employee that he must provide the employer a copy of the order if it mentions or in any way impacts the workplace or the employee's ability to do his job.
Gene, I understand you were served a protection of abuse order yesterday by the local police department. You don't talk a great deal about your home life. We have some services available that I just want to go over with you a little bit. There's a great deal of support in the community. We have a domestic violence policy that if you'd like to take a look at that, it'll identify many of those services. If the protection of abuse order in any way impacts the workplace or your ability to perform the job in the workplace, we do ask that you bring in a copy of that. Okay? Our objective is to make sure that we help you manage through this and not violate it in any way.
When an employer is thinking about what to do when they discover that one of their employees is a perpetrator of domestic abuse or violence, or it's highly likely that they are, their goals should be above everything else safety. Safety for the victim and accountability for the perpetrator. Our goals with this is not that perpetrators of abuse should become somehow unemployable or unemployed, because that in fact might make victims less safe.
The 9th best practice encourages employers to support employees in complying with civil orders of protection.
Our policy requires an employee to come to us if they have a protection from abuse order that will impact their job performance. If they do not, and we find out that they do, our policy is clear about that we can discipline them for not telling us about the protection from abuse order.
Within the workforce, if we became aware of an employee that had a restraining order against them, we'd want to take and look at the restraining order in terms of, are we providing any type of opportunity for that employee to continue that type of behavior? It could be phone records, it could be used to company vehicles. It depends on what the person's role is and why they ended up with a restraining order to begin with.
An employer who has an employee with a protection order out against that individual really needs to know what the restrictions are in that order. Are they prohibited from having contact? Are they prohibited from being in the vicinity of the individual? Is it a situation where one employee is the victim and the other employee is the abuser? What accommodations and protections does the employer have to put in place to ensure the safety of the victim?
Also, if a protection order is between two employees, an employer needs to be mindful that the victim isn't negatively affected by that order. If someone's schedule needs to be changed, it shouldn't be the victim's schedule.
What does the employer do if a process server appears on site and wants to serve their employees papers? You have a bunch of different options. It depends on what the papers are. If it's a criminal warrant, then you really don't have any choice. That's something that you have to allow to happen. If it's a civil warrant or papers that they're serving, it's usually in the best interest of the company to help coordinate between the process server and the employee. What we basically do is offer the employee the option of accepting the papers there or contacting the process server.
The final best practice outlines how an employer can plan ahead to develop a safe process for separation of employment if an employee who is a domestic violence abuser has to be terminated.
If an employer has to terminate an employee due to domestic violence, the clear goal should be to lay out to the employee precisely what they did, what company policy was violated, and why this is leading to termination.
As an organization, our goal during any termination process would be to ensure that the termination clearly is done in such a way that all the rights of all the individuals associated with that would be honored and respected. In this instance, clearly safety is number one, and that is the reason for the action. And number two, it's also a direct addressing of a workplace misconduct issue, but honoring and respecting all individuals' rights during the course of that action would be a hallmark.
Obviously, if you've paid any attention to the media and seen stories, people that are released from companies can get angry and come back. And obviously, that's one of the things you really want to avoid when you're working through a termination. Respect to the employee through the process is paramount. If you want to do one thing and really focus on it, make sure that the employee isn't surprised. It should be something that has come from a series of meetings. Something should be done respectfully, if at all possible, face-to-face. And the employee should always be given the opportunity to explain what happened and respond to the concerns that the employer is bringing forward.
During this stage, the best thing an employer can do when they're going to be terminating an employee for being an abuser is to contact their local police department and or contact their local domestic violence service provider. Let them know what they're doing and ask for their assistance in assisting the victim. The best thing you can do is not to be contacting the victim and getting in the middle of that process.
An employer's goal, if an employee needs to be terminated for domestic violence, must be to ensure the safety of the coworkers. But also, I think we need to consider the safety of the person at home. We are sending an abuser home, essentially, when we terminate them. It's very important to, I would say, to take every step possible that you can prior to actually terminating the employee because of that.
Work with local abuse prevention organizations. Develop policies and procedures. Provide employee training and education. Screen employees for abuse and violence. Conduct criminal background checks. Orient new employees to your culture. Rescreen when employees take new positions. Investigate allegations of abuse. Comply with civil orders of protection, and develop a process for separation of employment. By adapting and using these best practices, employers can minimize the risks that domestic abusers present to the workplace and can make their workplaces safer for everyone.
By addressing this issue in a proactive way, I think entrepreneurs and organizational leaders really go a long way at helping their organizations be successful by avoiding costs that they might have to deal with, by limiting legal exposure, and also helping their organization be effective by enabling their employees to be well and to be focused on the work at hand.
For employers who have never addressed this issue in the workplace, I would say step up to this plate. Understand the connection between this conduct at home and its impact on your workplace.
For a victim of abuse, it's very empowering to know that they're not the only one who's saying to the perpetrator, what you're doing is wrong and we won't stand for it.
The ultimate goal in changing the workplace culture around domestic violence is to take it out from behind the walls, take it out from hiding, and address it head on. We as a community cannot conquer this horror of domestic violence until everyone chips in and takes a stand against it.